My husband showed up at my grandfather's bakery at 7 in the morning with a woman I'd never seen before and a locksmith. I'd been there since 4:30, same as every Tuesday, pulling sourdough loaves from the oven and setting out the first trays of morning pastries. The cafe regulars, Pete from the hardware store 2 blocks over, the nurses from the urgent care on 5th, the retired couple who split a croissant every single morning without fail. They were already settled into their usual spots when the bell above the door chimed and I looked up. My husband walked in like he owned the place, which, for 13 years, he had let me believe he did too. The woman behind him was maybe 30, in a blazer that cost more than our weekly flour order, carrying a leather portfolio like she was about to close a real estate deal. She looked around the shop the way people look at a property they're about to gut and renovate. Not with admiration, with calculation. "Shh, you need to go home," my husband said, loud enough for Pete to set down his coffee cup. "Tamsin and I have a meeting with the leaseholder this morning. You're not going to be involved in this going forward." I looked at the locksmith, who had the decency to stare at the floor. I looked at the woman, Tamsin, who did not look away. She reached into her portfolio and pulled out a stack of papers. "I'm the new operating partner," she said. Her smile was the kind you practiced. "We've been meaning to do this transition more formally, but given the timeline, you're going to want to call someone," Pete said quietly from his corner table. He was already looking at his phone. I didn't cry. I didn't squirm. I didn't throw a sourdough loaf at my husband, which I will admit crossed my mind. I took off my apron, folded it over the counter, and picked up my phone. I dialed a number I'd saved 4 months ago, after my grandfather's attorney had sent me a certified letter. I hadn't fully understood until the second time I read it. "This is Faye," I said. "He's here, the locksmith is here, she's here, I need you now." The woman on the other end didn't hesitate. "Don't engage. Don't sign anything. I'll be there in 25 minutes. My grandfather had opened this bakery in 1971 with $1,200, a commercial oven he'd bought secondhand from a closed diner in Pittsburgh, and a recipe book his own mother had written by hand in a composition notebook she'd carried across the Atlantic. The notebook was still here, in a laminated sleeve behind the front counter, too fragile to touch but too important to lock away. 3 generations of women in my family had baked from those recipes. My grandmother had raised 4 kids on what this place earned. My mother had worked the morning shift all through my childhood, and I had stood on a step stool beside her at 5 years old, learning to crimp pie crust. When my grandfather died 2 years ago, I had been the one to come every morning. My husband had offered to take over the business side, and I had let him, because I was grieving and exhausted and he was good with spreadsheets. He handled payroll, the supplier accounts, the quarterly taxes. I baked, I ran the counter, I talked to the customers. I kept the place alive the way my family always had, by showing up before dawn. I had thought we were a team. I had thought wrong. Tamsin had set her portfolio on the counter. My counter, the one my grandfather had built himself from reclaimed oak, and was making quiet observations to my husband about operational inefficiencies. When the door opened again 22 minutes later, the woman who walked in wore a gray blazer and sensible shoes, and had the kind of calm that comes from having sat across from a lot of liars in depositions. She introduced herself to the room like she had every right to be there. Which, it turned out, she did. "I'm the attorney for the estate of Raymond Howard deceased," she said, her voice carried without any effort. "Specifically, I represent the Raymond Howard Family Trust, the sole legal owner of this property and business. I'm here on behalf of the trust's beneficiary." She looked at me. "That's you." My husband turned slowly. "The trust," my attorney continued, opening her own folder, "was established in 2019, 2 years before Mr. Howard's death. At that time, he transferred the property deed, the business license, the commercial lease, and all associated accounts into an irrevocable trust with sole beneficiary designation to his granddaughter. She slid a copy of the document across the counter toward my husband. "Your name does not appear on any of these documents. You have never been a legal owner or partner of this business. You have no authority to add an operating partner, transfer any interest, or make any changes to locks, personnel, or operations." Tamsin's smile didn't move, but something behind her eyes did. That's my husband started. He told me. When we got married, he said. Mr. Howard said a great many things to a great many people, my attorney said. What he said to his attorney in writing, with notarization and witnesses, is what matters here. She pulled out a second document. This is a cease and desist, effective immediately, covering any attempt to represent ownership interest in this property or business. And this, a third document, is the beginning of a fraud investigation. Over the past 3 years, someone used this business's name and federal tax ID to apply for 2 SBA loans totaling approximately $94,000. The applications included a forged signature on the authorization forms. I heard Pete set his coffee cup down again, very carefully. Forged, my husband repeated. His voice had gone flat. Your wife's signature, my attorney said. On both applications, the funds were disbursed to an account in your name alone. The SBA has been notified. The FBI's Financial Crimes Division has been copied on all documentation. The word FBI landed in the room like a brick through glass. My husband sat down on one of the cafe chairs. I watched the color leave his face the way water drains from a sink. I was going to pay it back, he said, almost to himself. The business had a bad quarter. I was going to. You were going to forge your wife's name on federal loan applications to cover personal losses, my attorney said. That's not a business decision. That's a federal crime. Tamsin had taken a very small, very deliberate step toward the door. She stays, my attorney said, without looking at her. We have questions about her involvement. I had known something was wrong for 4 months, since the day my grandfather's attorney had first called me. The certified letter had arrived, the week after what would have been my grandfather's 83rd birthday. And I'd almost set it aside unopened, assuming it was another piece of estate paperwork. But the letter wasn't about paperwork. It was a notification. The trust's monitoring system had flagged an unauthorized loan inquiry using the business's federal tax ID. My grandfather's attorney, who had remained, per the trust's explicit instructions, a silent watchdog over the property, had been automatically alerted. She had called me instead of my husband because the trust documents were clear. I was the only authorized party. I hadn't told my husband. I hadn't known what to do with what I knew. Not yet, not while I was still fitting the pieces together. So I had met with the attorney twice, reviewed documents I'd never known existed, and saved her number under bakery emergency in my phone. My grandfather had known. That was the part I kept returning to as I stood in my own bakery watching my husband stare at federal fraud documents. My grandfather had known something was off about the man I married. He'd never said it out loud. Not in any way I'd recognized, but he had spent the last 2 years of his life quietly, methodically building a wall around everything he loved, making certain that whatever happened, I would still be standing. There was more I hadn't known yet. My attorney reached into her briefcase one final time and pulled out an envelope. Cream-colored. My name written on the front in my grandfather's handwriting. The large, careful letters of a man who had learned English as a second language, and always wrote like every word counted. He left this with me when he finalized the trust, she said. He asked that I give it to you on the day it became necessary. He was specific about that. He said you'd know what day that was. I took it with hands that weren't entirely steady. Can I? I looked toward the back of the bakery, toward the kitchen, the room that smelled like bread and butter and 50 years of early mornings. Can I read this in back? It's your bakery, my attorney said simply. I walked past my husband. He didn't move. The kitchen was exactly as I'd left it 2 hours ago. Cooling racks lined the far wall. The old Hobart mixer my grandfather had bought in 1989 stood in the corner like a monument. On the hook by the back door hung my grandmother's apron. The one with the hand-embroidered strawberries along the hem that she'd made herself, that had hung on that hook for 30 years. And underneath it, tossed there sometime this morning, was Tamsin's blazer. I lifted the blazer off the hook and set it on the floor. Then I sat down at the prep table, where my grandfather had done his crossword every morning before opening. And I opened the letter. His handwriting covered both sides of 2 pages. The letters grew slightly larger toward the end, where his arthritis had been worst, but every word was legible. He had written this carefully. He had written this knowing I would need it. Faye girl. If you're reading this, then the thing I was hoping wouldn't happen has happened. I'm sorry for that. I wish I had been wrong. I want you to know that I didn't say anything while I was alive, because I didn't have proof, only a feeling, and a feeling isn't something you use to break a person's marriage. But I had enough of a feeling that I made sure, very sure, that no matter what, this bakery would still be yours. Your grandmother built this place as much as I did. She never asked for her name on anything. That was a different time. And I regret it. I made sure your name was on everything. Just yours. Not because I didn't trust you to share. You've always been more generous than is good for you. But because I didn't trust him. I watched him in this kitchen for 7 years. He never learned to crimp the pie crust, even when you showed him. That's a small thing, but small things add up. I suspected something with the accounts about 2 years before I passed. I couldn't prove it then. That's why I set up the monitoring with my attorney. I knew if I was right, she'd find it. There's something else in this envelope. An account I set up in your name only, over the last 8 years. A little from every good month. A little from every catering job that went well. I told your grandmother I was saving for a new oven. She would have laughed if she'd known what I was actually saving for. She always said you'd need a soft landing someday. The account has $47,000 in it. Fix the roof. It's needed it for 2 years and I kept putting it off. Hire real help so you're not working the morning shift alone anymore. You've been doing that too long. You make the best sourdough in this county. Your great-grandmother made it before you, and your grandmother after her. And someday I hope you'll teach someone else. That's what this place is for. Not for his spreadsheets. Not for her portfolio. Keep the recipe book behind the counter where people can see it. Keep the apron on the hook. I love you more than any Tuesday morning crossword. Grandpa. I sat with the letter for a long time before I went back out front. The retired couple was still at their table. So were Pete, and the nurses, and the young woman who usually grabbed a coffee to go. And was today, apparently, staying. They had all quietly arranged themselves into something that looked very much like a perimeter. My attorney was on the phone. My husband was still in the chair. The fraud documents in his lap. Looking at the floor. Tamsin was standing near the window with the particular stillness of someone running numbers in her head. There's something you need to know, my attorney said, ending her call. About her specifically. Tamsin's chin came up slightly. When the trust monitoring flagged the loan applications, we needed to determine whether anyone else had been involved in structuring them. My attorney set a printed document on the counter. Her real name isn't the one she gave your husband. She has 3 prior civil judgments against her in 2 states for fraudulent business partnership claims. The pattern is consistent. She identifies a small business owner with encumbered finances, forms a personal relationship, helps them falsify documents to access capital, then positions herself as an operating partner, with a claim to the business assets when the owner defaults on the fraudulent loans. She was going to take the bakery, I said. Once your husband defaulted on the SBA loans, which he would have eventually, given the repayment terms, the business would have been in severe financial jeopardy. She would have stepped in as the rescuer, with paperwork already establishing her as an operating partner. Small business fraud is harder to prosecute than people assume. She's walked away from this twice before. She won't walk away this time, my husband said from the chair. His voice was hollow. It was the first time that morning he had sounded like himself. No, my attorney agreed. She won't. The FBI has been building a case on her for approximately 14 months. Your husband's loan applications gave them what they needed to move forward. She looked at Tamsin. The U.S. Attorney's Office will be making contact within the week. I'd recommend you both secure separate legal representation immediately. I watched my husband look at the woman he had brought into my grandfather's bakery to replace me, and I watched him understand, fully, finally, what she actually was. Not a fresh start. Not a partner. A trap he had walked into while he was building one for me. He opened his mouth. Don't, I said, not loudly, not with any heat, just don't. He closed it. I've got the whole thing on video, Pete said from the corner, holding up his phone. From the minute they walked in, "My daughter works in the county DA's office. Already sent it to her." "So did I," said the retired gentleman by the window with complete composure. The locksmith gave me his card. One of the nurses offered. I asked him a few questions. He was pretty forthcoming once he understood the situation. I stood in the middle of my grandfather's bakery, surrounded by people who had been coming here for years, some of them for decades. And I felt something I hadn't felt in 4 months of carefully holding the knowledge of what my husband had done. I felt for the first time, like the ground beneath my feet was solid again. My husband left with his own copies of the documentation and a referral for a criminal defense attorney. My attorney was thorough about such things. Tamsin left separately. In a rental car, I noted without surprise, and was on her phone before she reached the sidewalk. Whatever she was planning next, she was already working on it. That was the kind of person she was. The locksmith changed the locks again, properly this time, with keys that went to me, and to my attorney, and to no one else. The FBI made contact 4 days later. My attorney sat with me through every conversation. The investigation moved faster than I expected. It turned out Tamsin's prior victims had been cooperating for months, and the loan applications had provided the final piece of a much larger case. By spring, there were federal charges filed. By summer, plea negotiations. By the time the leaves turned, both of them were facing consequences that would take years to fully resolve. My husband's attorney sent divorce papers in February. I had my own attorney review everything. 13 years of shared life isn't simple to untangle. But the bakery was never in question. It had never been his. I used $15,000 of my grandfather's money to finally fix the roof. Another portion went to equipment. A new proofing rack and a display case that didn't fog up every time someone opened the door. I hired 2 part-time employees, a college student for weekday mornings and a retired woman from the neighborhood, who'd been telling me for 2 years she used to bake professionally and could I please let her help. I finally let her help. I moved the recipe book to a glass-fronted case so people could see it better. I kept my grandmother's apron on the hook. In January, I started a monthly gathering on Tuesday evenings, after close, for women who were navigating what I'd navigated. The quiet, exhausting process of separating your finances and your sense of yourself from someone who had treated both as resources to be used. Word got around the way. Word gets around in a town where people have been buying their bread from the same place for 50 years. The first gathering had 7 women sitting around, pulled together tables with coffee and day-old pastries. By March, we needed to open the back room. I didn't think of myself as an expert in anything except sourdough. I had been protected by a grandfather who loved me carefully enough to plan for threats he couldn't name, an attorney who had taken a dead man's instructions seriously, and neighbors who had refused to look away. I'd had help, a lot of it. What I could offer was the bakery, the Tuesday evenings, and the specific, non-theoretical understanding that comes from having stood behind your own counter while someone tried to take everything, and watching them fail. "You didn't look scared," Pete told me once, months after it happened. We were the last 2 in the shop on a slow Wednesday afternoon. And he was having his 3rd cup of coffee, which his doctor would not have approved of. When they walked in that morning, "You took off your apron and you looked like you already knew something they didn't." "I did," I said. I had spent 4 months knowing, watching, making sure I understood exactly what I had before I let anyone see that I had it. My grandfather had given me that, not just the property or the account or the documents, but the time to be ready. He had set everything in motion and then waited, trusting that the right moment would come, and that I would recognize it. He used to say that bread teaches you patience. You can't rush the rise, you can't argue with fermentation. You do your part, you measure. You mix, you shape, and then you wait, and you trust the process, and you come back in the morning to see what held. He had spent the last 2 years of his life doing exactly that. Measuring, shaping, trusting that when the moment came, everything he had built would hold. On the first anniversary of what I privately called the locksmith morning, I baked 2 extra dozen sourdough loaves, and left them on the counter with a handwritten card, "For anyone who needs it." From Raymond Howard's kitchen, 1971 to whenever. By 8:15, they were gone. I started a new batch, the way you do, the way you always do. That was the thing my grandfather had understood about this place, about all of it, that I was only beginning to fully understand myself. It didn't run out. It didn't stop. It just kept rising, kept feeding people, kept going. Because someone had cared enough to make sure it would. One morning at a time, one Tuesday at a time, one loaf at a time. The way it had always been, and the way it would keep being, long after any of us were done arguing over who owned what. The recipe book stays behind the counter. The apron stays on the hook.